Well, we're continuing our symposium with a talk by Sara Tas, Associate Curator at the Van Gogh Museum. She curated the exhibition Eet al Adnan, Color as Language, last year. Fantastic exhibition. She is currently engaged on a long-term research project into Dr. Paul Gachet. And as part of this work, she presents a small exhibition. I hope you have seen it, or that I'm urging you to go see it. It's on the second floor of the permanent collection. As Marije has already mentioned, it's really a very interesting and important addition to the Van Gogh and Auvers exhibition. And that's called Dr. Gachet and Van Gogh Experiments in Etching. Sara is also working on the online catalogue of paintings and drawings by Van Gogh's contemporaries here at the Van Gogh Museum. And before joining our team, she was a curator at the Jewish Museum here in Amsterdam. Sara, thank you very much.
A small but remarkable aspect of Van Gogh's period in Auvers is the etching, the only etching he ever made, a portrait of Dr. Gachet. Maybe a rather insignificant work of art, a tryout, so to say, but one that is telling about Van Gogh and his method of working, as well as about Gachet and his relationship to artists. In this lecture, I will discuss this etching experiment. I will address the context in which it was created and the relation between the two men and what this graphic work meant to both of them. In the search of a suitable place for Vincent to live after his stay in the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, Theo had asked artist Camille Pissarro already in September 1889 if his brother could stay with him for a while in the spring. Pissarro lived in Erangui, just below Pontoise, a rural area that Theo felt could offer the peace Vincent needed, but was close to Paris so they could see each other more often. Pissarro and his wife were reluctant to have the family dynamics disrupted by a stranger who was struggling with his mental health, but they did offer to help and look for an alternative. Pissarro told Theo about Dr. Paul Gachet, who lived in Auvers-sur-Oise, an alternative doctor, a doctor with affinity for art who also painted in his spare time. As a medical student in Paris in the 1850s, Gachet had spent most of his time in artistic circles. Through his childhood friend from Lille, the painter Armand Gautier, Gachet got to know many artists, including Courbet, Manet, and Guillaumin. He completed his studies in Montpellier in 1859 with a thesis on the phenomenon of melancholy, a term used for depression or otherwise mental health problems. That same year, Gautier painted this full-length portrait of him, and Gachet opened his cabinet in Paris. He further specialized in homeopathy and electrotherapy, with a focus on maladies nerveuses and maladies chroniques. He also specifically focused on women and children. Artists started not only to belong to his circle of friends, but also to his circle of patients. Thanks to his father's inheritance, Gachet could buy a second house in Auvers-sur-Oise in 1872, where his tuberculosis-stricken wife could benefit from the healthy air. Gachet believed, like Vincent van Gogh, that it was not healthy to live in the city. Almost immediately, he set up his own studio in Auvers, in the attic, and also started etching there. It is not known when he bought his own etching press, but it was probably not long after he had bought his house, as his first, rather clumsy etchings date from that time. As said, the artist Camille Pissarro lived close by, and he was one of the artists who regularly sought medical advice from Gachet for his family and paid the doctor with works of art. From 1873, Pissarro made many etchings, some of which he printed at Gachet. During the same period, Paul Cézanne and Armand Guillaumin also worked in Gachet's studio, and together they experimented with etching, as this drawing testifies. Cézanne, whose father Gachet had once met in Aix in the south of France, also settled in Auvers for some time. and together with his friend Guillaumin, Pissarro and Gachet, he too embarked on a short-lived etching adventure. A friendly venture. The etchings of the four friends show many similarities. Cézanne would only make 5 etchings in total and would never pick up the copper blade again in his career. Pissarro is the only one of the 4 friends who showed immediate talent. Gachet's friendship with those and other artists would continue, and more than once he granted them and their families medical advice for which they could pay for in works of art. From time to time, Gachet also began buying art through dealers. He lent works for the first Impressionist exhibition and published his own etchings in the magazine Paris à l'eau forte. All this in addition to maintaining his practice in Paris and his additional positions during the 1880s as a school doctor and a doctor for the Northern Railways. Given the many connections in the same Parisian artistic circles as art dealer Theo, actually it came as no surprise that Theo ended up with Dr. Gachet in the search for a doctor who would be suitable for his brother Vincent. In the spring of 1890, the plan for Van Gogh's move to Auvers became concrete. Theo met Gachet briefly in Paris in March and was excited and hopeful that his doctor would be able to understand and even help Vincent. Once Vincent arrived in Paris on Saturday the 17th of May, he decided not to wait in the crowded city for a consultation with Gachet, but to leave for Auvers as early as Tuesday. At first, Gachet had quite a few reservations about the doctor he found there and to whom the brothers had placed their hopes. He found him eccentric and at least as nervous as himself. His house was full of dark and strange things, except for some Impressionist paintings. But the grief over the loss of his wife 15 years before was imprinted on Gachet's face. And this was precisely what made Van Gogh nevertheless feel sympathy and knew immediately that he wanted to do a portrait of him. Van Gogh's first critical attitude towards Gachet turned when he realized that he had found an ally in the doctor, someone who was sympathetic to artists in need and who both all seemed to understand and admire Van Gogh's work. Around June 3rd, Van Gogh painted the first portrait of the doctor, with books by the Goncourt brothers and a foxglove flower in a glass in the foreground. Soon after, he made a second version, intended for the doctor. This one is more stylized and less elaborate, with a sprig of foxglove on the table. To his sister Wilhelmine, he wrote, "I would like to do portraits which would look like appropriations to people a century later. So I don't try to do us by photographic resemblance, but by our passionate expressions, using as means of expression and intensification of the character our science and modern taste for color." Over a week later, on June 15, Van Gogh produced an etched portrait of the doctor. This etching, which Gachet's son later entitled Homme à la pipe, is related to the two painted portraits of the doctor, with the same melancholic look. However, where in the paintings the attributes in the foreground on the table play a role in the composition, in the etching the portrait is completed by elements of Gachet's garden in the background and the pipe in his hand. The free and dynamic line work, so characteristic for Van Gogh, is clearly recognizable in this graphic medium. But although Van Gogh saw the potential of etching, both artistically and also by means to distribute his work, it remained with the one etching plate of his hand. According to the recollections of Gachet's son, Van Gogh was given a prepared etching plate and an etching needle in his hand by his father. He portraited Gachet in the garden directly on the plate. After which, they printed the plate together at the etching press in Gachet's house. It is completely unknown how many copies Van Gogh and Gachet printed together that same day. What is certain is that many more copies were subsequently printed by Gachet and later by his son, also after Van Gogh's death. As the plates stayed in their possession, They also had the etching plate printed later by external professional printers. When Schaar van Heugte and Fieke Paps compiled their publication on Van Gogh's graphic work in 1995, they were familiar with about 60 copies of the etching. Since then, thanks to the administration of Monique Hageman, we now know more than double that number. It remains quite a puzzle to determine which copy was printed when and by whom, and to draw conclusions about the authenticity of each copy. What is fairly certain is that the no less than 9 copies of the etching that the Van Gogh Museum holds, which come from a family collection, are among the first prints. And a closer look at these reveal a few things about the process of their creation and about the intention the artist might have had with this experiment. The series clearly shows Van Gogh in experience. To start with the basics, the etching press was set incorrectly, so that in all copies the right-hand side of the sheet was printed much thicker than the left-hand side. The edges of the sheets are smudged and even show some fingerprints. A professional etcher would always try to avoid this. Now this was probably the first print, but the image is incomplete. There is a piece missing from the bottom, which can be seen in the other etchings. Could Van Gogh and Gachet have stopped turning the roller too early, so that the bottom was not printed? The smudge on the top right corner shows clearly that the press had been set incorrectly, resulting in too much ink on that side of the paper. In this print, a lot of ink has been deliberately applied to the edges, emphasizing the face of the person portraited. It brings to mind the quote, "Portraits which would look like appartiations, like spirits or visions." To compensate for the incorrect setting of the etching press, in this copy it was printed much lighter. As a result, the left half of the print became far too light. Van Gogh tried to correct this by adding thick contours on the shoulder, the sleeve, the pipe, the ear, the eyebrow in black ink after the printing. Thus he adjusted the image as a painter and not as a printmaker. This print came after, and it's technically the most successful in the series so far. Following the previous print, the etching plate was modified. The left shoulder area was enhanced with more lines. Notice especially the protruding line just above the shoulder. This little line. So technically it's the second state. The coat was left a little darker this time, and the small tree in the top left corner is nice and clear. It seems like Van Gogh had learned how to use the etching press technique a little by now. Van Gogh probably used yellow ochre oil paint for this etching and dark blue and reddish for the ones next to it. Making these etchings in different colors was quite experimental at the time. No one who had used Gachet's etching press had experimented with color before, so it is very unlikely that colored printing ink was at hand at Gachet's studio. Professional color etchings among artists was really in its infancy. And giving the quote from the letter to his sister, however, it is not so surprising that Van Gogh wanted to work directly with color during his first experiment at the etching press, because he wanted to use color to express and intensify character. Another practical question is now, how did Van Gogh get color? Could Van Gogh have simply used pre-existing oil paints? We are currently analyzing XRF measurements to see what pigments were used and whether they match oil paints he used during the same periods. But more measurements are needed to determine the exact composition and compare it with other stats. It wouldn't be such an odd move for Van Gogh, who, after all, in his The Hague period, when he experimented a few times with lithography, began using black lithographic printing ink for his drawings. Van Gogh was clearly not someone who thought in the limits in the use of media, and that even at the very first time he was able to try the etching technique, he went about it in a cross-border and unconventional way. We know from the letters that Van Gogh had sent a print to Gauguin, who barely reacted on this proof etching, which is, I must say, a rather nice version and maybe the most successful one. He also sent the etching to his brother Theo, who replies to him enthusiastically on June 23rd. He writes, I must tell you something about your etching. It's a real painter's etching. No refinement in the procedure, but a drawing done on metal. I like this drawing very much. It's amusing that Dr. Gachet has this press, because painters who make etchings are always complaining that they have to go to the printer for the proofs. Now this real painter's etching is a true compliment. It doesn't necessarily refer to the pictorial language of the smudges and the lines in the copper plate, which have become part of the image. But you can see the direction in which the paint was applied, and it looks almost like it was done with a brush. But Theo was at the very same time working with other peintres graveurs, and also took up the adventure as a publisher of an album of lithographs of Monticelli paintings done by master printmaker Auguste Lauzet. The album had just appeared, and I will come back to it in a minute. What the letter makes clear is that Vincent had sent Theo a print, but did he immediately send all 9 of the prints, which we now still have in our collection? There is no differentiation between them. They all bear the same stamp by Gachet, and they're all on the same paper, and they all have the same remarkable dating in the upper right corner. The dating was done in the plate with a dry needle in Gachet's handwriting. An inscription in the etching would require writing in mirror image, something Gachet was more experienced at than Van Gogh, so that's probably why he did it and not Van Gogh. Van Heugden and Papst's publication convincingly argues that Gachet must have simply been mistaken about the month, because Van Gogh had not arrived in Auvers until the 20th of May. And so the etching was made on the 15th of June, which matches also the dating in the letters. Now, what possibility did Van Gogh see in this etching experiment? He knew that his brother was into publishing artistic prints, and that this was a good way to distribute art to a wider audience and collectors. These prints were not simple reproductions, but artistic projects, translations of paintings into a new medium with its own potential. In the correspondence, the brothers refer several times to this album, a series of works by painter Adolphe Monticelli, admired by Van Gogh, lithographed by the master printmaker Auguste Lauzet. Vincent wrote, I really hope to do a few etchings of subjects from the south, let's say 6, since I can print them free of charge at Mr. Gachet's. He is willing to run them off for nothing if I do them. It's certainly a thing that must be done and will act in such a way that it in some way will form a sequel to the Lauzet Monticelli album. This album, for which Theo had taken up the role as a publisher through Brousseau, Valadon and She, contains beautiful lithographs. Their monochromatic colors evoke the same kind of atmosphere that Van Gogh series of colors, colored etchings. It could very well be that this album, which was published at the very same time and of which Theo had already a proof at hand when Vincent had been with him in Paris just before he went to Auvers, was the very reason Vincent experimented with the several monochrome colors in his etchings. So to draw a conclusion, what was the meaning of this etching adventure for Van Gogh? In the first place, in terms of the subject, it was in line with what he regarded as the highest aim for art at the time, to create modern portraits, while at the same time using color to express and perform character. Most of all, it was a tryout for something that could be done if things would have been different and if he would not have decided to end his life soon after. But what does this adventure mean to Gachet? He had already seduced other artists to experiment with etching, so it was a logical step to also invite Van Gogh to use this etching press. When Van Gogh died, Gachet was devastated. Together with Theo, he immediately made plans for a biography of him and a catalogue of Van Gogh's work. It was to be an artistic edition with handwritten text in different colors and, most importantly, his work in etchings, which he would print himself. But nothing came of this. With Theo's death just a few months after Vincent and the bar set so high, the undertaking proved too great a task for Gachet. He simply wasn't able, or he didn't dare. But the etching adventure with Van Gogh had a huge impact on Gachet, which was evident just from the sheer number of times he and his son later had the only etching plate of Van Gogh's hand printed and distributed. Van Gogh had said in one of his letters that he would be fine if Gachet could make prints of his hand for his own benefit. And this was exactly what he did. Especially for his son, it also eventually became a means of highlighting the special relationship between Van Gogh and Gachet. Thank you for your attention.